Section 11 of Reviews by Oscar Wilde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reviews by Oscar Wilde. Edited by Robert Ross. Section 11. As You Like It at Coombe House. Read by Patty Brugman. Dramatic Review, June 6th, 1885. In Théophile Gautier's first novel, that golden book of spirit and sense, that holy writ of beauty, there is a most fascinating account of an amateur performance of As You Like It, in the large orangery of a French country house. Yet, lovely as Gautier's description is, the real presentation of the play last week at Coombe seemed to me lovelier still, for not merely were there present in all those elements of poetry and picturesqueness which La Matre Implacable so desired, but to them was added also the exquisite charm of the open woodland and the delightful freedom of the open air. Nor indeed could the pastoral players have made a more fortunate selection of a play. A tragedy under the same conditions would have been impossible, for tragedy is the exaggeration of the individual, and nature thinks nothing of dwarfing a hero by a holly bush, and reducing a heroine to the mere effect of colour. The subtleties also of facial expression are in the open air most entirely lost, and while this would be a serious defect in the presentation of a play which deals immediately with psychology, in the case of a comedy, where the situations predominate over the characters, we do not feel it nearly so much. And Shakespeare himself seems to have clearly recognized this difference, for while he had Hamlet and Macbeth always played by artificial light, he acted As You Like It, and the rest of his comedies en plein jour. The condition, then, under which this comedy was produced, by Lady Archibald Campbell and Mr. Godwin, did not place any great limitations on the actor's art, and increased tenfold the value of the play as a picture. Through an alley of white hawthorn and gold laburnum, we passed into the green pavilion that served as the theatre. The air sweet with the odour of lilac and with the blackbird's song, and when the curtain fell into its trench of flowers, and the play commenced, we saw before us a real forest, and we knew it to be Arden. For with whoop and shout, up through the rustling fern, came the foresters trooping. The banished duke took his seat beneath the tall elm, and as his lords lay round him on the grass, the rich melody of Shakespeare's blank verse began to reach our ears. And all through the performance this delightful sense of joyous woodland life was sustained, and even when the scene was left empty for the shepherd to drive his flock across the sward, or for Rosalind to school Orlando in love-making, far away we could hear the shrill halloo of the hunter, and catch now and then the faint music of some distant horn. One distinct dramatic advantage was gained by the mise en scène. The abrupt exits and entrances which are necessitated on the real stage by the inevitable limitations of space were in many cases done away with, and we saw the characters coming gradually toward us through brake and underwood, or passing away down the slope till they were lost in some deep recess of the forest, the effect of distance thus gained being largely increased by the faint wreaths of blue mist that floated at times across the background. Indeed, I never saw an illustration at once so perfect and so practical of the aesthetic value of smoke. As for the players themselves, the pleasing naturalness of their method harmonized delightfully with their natural surroundings. Those of them who were amateurs were too artistic to be stagey, and those who were actors too experienced to be artificial. The humorous sadness of Jacques, that philosopher in search of sensation, found a perfect exponent in Mr. Hermann Vezin. Touchstone has been so often acted as a low comedy part that Mr. Eliot's rendering of the swift, sententious fool was a welcome change, and a more graceful and winning Phoebe than Mrs. Plowden, a more tender Cecilia than Miss Shelter, a more realistic Audrey than Miss Fulton I have never seen. Rosalind suffered a good deal through the omission of the first act. We saw, I mean, more of the saucy boy than we did of the noble girl, and though the persiflage always told, the poetry was often lost. Still Miss Calhoun gave much pleasure, and Lady Archibald Campbell's Orlando was a really remarkable performance. Too melancholy, some seem to think it. Yet is not Orlando lovesick? Too dreamy, I heard it said. Yet Orlando is a poet, and even admitting that the vigour of the lad who tripped up the Duke's wrestler was hardly sufficiently emphasized, still in the low music of Lady Archibald Campbell's voice, and in the strange beauty of her movements and gestures, there was a wonderful fascination, and the visible presence of romance quite consoled me for the possible absence of robustness. Among the other characters should be mentioned Mr. Claude Ponsonby's First Lord, Mr. de Cordova's Corin, a bit of excellent acting, and the Silvis of Mr. Webster. As regards the costumes, the colour scheme was very perfect. Brown and green were the dominant notes, and yellow was most artistically used. There were, however, two distinct discords. Touchstone's motley was far too glaring, and the crude white of Rosalind's bridal raiment in the last act was absolutely displeasing. A contrast may be striking, but should never be harsh. And lovely in colour as Mrs. Plowden's dress was, a sort of panegyric on a pansy, I am afraid that in Shakespeare's Arden there were no Chelsea china shepherdesses, and I am sure that the romance of Phoebe does not need to be intensified by any reminiscences of porcelain. Still, As You Like It has probably never been so well mounted, nor costumes worn with more ease and simplicity. Not the least charming part of the whole production was the music, which was under the direction of the Reverend Arthur Batson. The boys' voices were quite exquisite, and Mr. Walsham sang with much spirit. On the whole, the pastoral players are to be warmly congratulated on the success of their representation, and to the artistic sympathies of Lady Archibald Campbell, and the artistic knowledge of Mr. Godwin, I am indebted for a most delightful afternoon. Few things are so pleasurable as to be able, by an hour's drive, to exchange Piccadilly for Parnassus. End of As You Like It. By Oscar Wilde, edited by Robert Ross, and read by Patty Brugman.